Okay, we're diving into the letter of James today. For more on James, Mayhem series, all about James. Okay, you are more than welcome to start off by pausing and reading our 12 rules of reading biblical text. And if you don't like the 12 rules, well, this isn't the place for you. If you don't understand the 12 rules, go listen to the audiobook that is uploaded on this channel because I don't have time to go over it every time. It's our Bible study series that go pretty in depth. Warning, we're not language watching people. We're very salt of the earth, down to earth. It also does not follow the politically correct patterns of modern preachers and teachers. So if you're looking for that, also definitely not the place for you. I also do a lot of referring back to a book that I wrote and read aloud on this channel, that sort of takes you through the entire arc. So if I refer back, chances are I'm referring back to things in that book that you haven't listened to. So if you're confused, try that. And we also did a video where we went, it's short, but we kind of went through our cast of characters here and how all of these modern figures play into the biblical narrative. And we did this so that things could sort of, stick in people's heads about who all of these people are and what their roles are. So if you're confused, go see that part. This is James the Zadik, one of my favorites. Brother of Jesus, otherwise known as James the Just. And he was the bishop, for lack of a better term, of the first church. They ignore him completely. And they're like, no, that was Peter. No, it was James. It was James. So we're going to take a look at what James had to say. I read James' letter like on the daily. It's probably my favorite book of the whole Bible. And it's so edifying and it's so clear. And it's just, I love James. And finally, we also did a purpose for reading to start this series. And then we did a vocabulary lesson, kind of going through some of the common terms and redefining those within the framework of understanding covenant jurisdiction under the reunited House of David in those patriarchal covenants that passed to the Messiah and what that means in that covenant scroll line perspective. So catch that. It's a definition of terms video. And with that, I think here we go. All right, let's start this up. Today, we're just going to tackle James 1 through 8. I call it the book of James, but truly that's a misspeak. It's really a letter of James. And we talked about in our intro to James back here, it's actually the letter of James is written specifically to counter pontifications and teachings of Saul of Tarsus, the enemy. But we're not reading it. That was the purpose for writing. That's not our purpose for reading. Our purpose for reading is to understand what he taught the best we can, knowing that it's true that he was countering Saul of Tarsus. We're not looking through it through that lens. And we're going to dispel the myth of you're just trying to be Jewish because of blah, blah, blah. So that's kind of what we're doing. So we're going to start with our purpose for reading this portion of James 1 through 18 is actually to give ourselves grounded in this word sin. There is so much attached to this word. Generally, people think of sin as a behavior. And it is, but it isn't. It's also a mindset. And I want to focus on the mindset of sin today a little bit. And we're going to drill down on one verse in particular in James. We're going to read the whole thing. But the verse that's really going to stand out here is, then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. All right. So that is our purpose for reading today. So let's just jump over here to James. And let's get through these first few verses. So open your Bible if you have one. Hopefully you have one. If not, pull it up online. Or take a Post-it note and write this down so you can read it on your own after this video. But James 1, I am in the English Standard Version, anglicized, whatever that is. And the reason I'm choosing this version today is because it is most aligned with the Mounce. And the Mounce is the one that does the interlinear Greek. And so I generally, when I'm sitting down and reading James and most things in the New Testament, I go to the interlinear Greek. I pointed this one out before. It's called the Mounce Reverse Interlineal New Testament. And this is fantastic because when you do Greek goes backwards. Okay. So for you guys, I think it's this way. I don't know. I'm on camera, so it's backwards. But we read from left to right. Okay. Greek goes from right to left. So when they try to interlinear it, it all goes backwards. And then the English follows the Greek. So the English goes backwards. And then the grammar's all screwy and it's really hard to decipher. Well, what this interlinear does is it takes the Greek and it lines it with the English so that you're reading it the correct way from right, whichever way that is for me on camera. I'm generally backwards. Okay, so I really like this one. And I can compare my translations with my Greek. But it's really annoying for other people to read this because it's like every other line, there's foolishness that people don't understand, right? So the closest version, at least for this, now this isn't always true, but I dug around a lot on here to kind of prepare this one for you. And I found that the English Standard Version mirrors the Greek and the language of the Greek the most closely. So that's why we're reading this one today. And it says greetings, or his greeting. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. If you want to know all about that, the 12 tribes in the dispersion and what that actually means and why this is talking to you. Come on, baby, now. And not the Jews, because we often heard James is for the Jews. I clear all that up. Go to the book. Do the vocabulary. But, I mean, we start off with this premise that James is indeed talking to you. Greetings. Well, greetings, James. All right. Count it joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness or endurance. The word that I would use there in modern English would be endurance. So trials produce endurance. And let endurance have its full effect or become full grown. Okay? So that you are perfect and complete and lacking in nothing. Trials produce endurance. Let endurance take its course. So you're complete and lacking in nothing. So much wisdom just in that first part, but we're not going there. I think you can pretty much interpret that on yourself, for yourself. So we're going to continue on. I mean, I could do a whole series just on that. We're going to keep going. I can say I read James constantly. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. This is often taken out of context to support other doctrines that say God will give you whatever you ask for. Okay, that's not what he says. He says, if you lack wisdom, let him ask God. What are you asking God for? Well, I'm asking for wisdom. I'm not asking for the lotto numbers. Okay, that's the difference. So don't let them fool you. This is why preachers who take things out of the, let him ask, they'll start here, right? Let him ask God, who gives generously without reproach, and it will be given to him. You know, welcome to Joel Osteen's ministry, okay? Because they're taking that little pieces of things out and not giving you whole context. James is talking about wisdom and learning and truth. This line always brings me back to King David's Psalms, because as you see in David, go back to our Psalms series, but David's always lamenting and complaining and going through David's stuff, right? He's always going through stuff. And one of the things that he's always doing is asking God for guidance. Show me your ways. Teach me your precepts. Explain to me what the fuck's going on here, right? Like, show me how to walk in your ways. And so David is one who's always praying for wisdom. And so this kind of reminds me of that. But I digress. God will give generously to all without reproach, and it will be given. So if you have questions, don't be afraid to ask God your questions, even if you think they're stupid or insulting, right? Like God's just come to him with an open heart and go, I am not understanding this, and this is pretty fucking janky. I tell God that all the time. I'm like, this is pretty fucking janky the way I'm thinking about it. Can you explain this to me? And then things will open up for you. Supernaturally will open up for you, because he will lead you. But you got to ask. All right, but he's got to ask in faith with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like the wave of the sea that's driven and tossed by the wind. For that person, the doubter, right, must not suppose he will receive anything from the Lord, because he's double-minded and unstable in all of his ways. Okay. This is kind of a concept that I use. I was arguing with, well, not arguing, but I'm kind of arguing with an old flame of mine, if you will, all the way back from college days. And he and I have had this. I'll just say the name, and some of you who know this person will be like, oh, yeah. Okay. Have had a lifelong, interesting struggle together. And we were arguing about God. And I told him, because he's not a God guy, I'm going to challenge you. All I want you to do is just sincerely in your heart, just say, God, if you're real, show me. Now, you don't want to test God, right? We don't test God. But he'll show you. If you honestly come to him and ask for evidence, he'll give you evidence if you need it, right? Can't be double-minded in doubt. Ask straight up and you will get. Okay? For wisdom. That's a test that most atheists can't honestly pass, and they won't do it because they're scared. All right, let the lowly brother, but I again digress. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation. Okay, this means when he says lowly here, now say I got to go to the Greek. I say I have to go to the Greek. Lowly means poor, basically low standing, and like think of a caste system, if you will. All right. So like low on the totem pole, low class, poor. Where's my M's? Let the brother of limited means. I like that better. The poor take pride in his high position. So the poor are actually doing better. And the wealthy brother in his humiliation or his lowly position. Because, and why should the poor be happy? And remember, the church that followed Jesus, James Church, the Ebion means poor, the poor. Because they really renounced wealth, because, this is where the whole money is the root of all evil thing comes from. They really renounced wealth because in order to obtain wealth and the things of the world, you really have to be morally compromised. Eventually, you're going to have to compromise your morals to keep your paycheck and to gain those riches and things. So this speaks to that, and we're going to sort of get to that morality question a little bit. So let the brother of limited means take pride in his high position, and the wealthy in his humiliation. Because like a flower in the meadow, he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the meadow. Its flower falls and its beauty fades. Well, in the same way, the rich man will fade away while pursuing his business. Okay? This is speaking to the morality of the wealthy. Just like a flower fades when the sun scorches, the rich man will fade away while we're pursuing his business. So the business of the world is going to take you away from the business of God. So he's comparing rich men to a withered flower in the field. It may look good and ain't gonna last. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast when tested, because once he's shown to be genuine, morally genuine, he's going to receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. And we talked about love and obedience being the same and equal in Jesus's book. If you love me, obey my commands, right? So he's talking about the moral character of people here. And I think that gets lost with people focusing on the money part, right? He's talking about the moral character of the poor versus the moral character of the wealthy. And just think of your job today, right? Doesn't it seem like all the corrupt, janky ass and immoral people are the ones who get the promotions and are constantly in charge? And that's one of the problems of society is good people don't seem to fucking get anywhere. And that's just how it is. No one when tempted should say, I'm being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted to do evil, and he himself tempts no one else. Interesting. Each person is tempted when by his own desire he is lured away and enticed. I'm going to get to that one. This is where we're going to dig down on sin. Then desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death. That's the verse we're going to drill down on today. And remember, this verse is in the context of being tempted by God. God can't tempt you. God doesn't do any evil. Okay? So I'm going to read that piece. We're going to come back and just read that part again to make sure we have the context, and then we'll jump back over to our slide deck. Do not be deceived, my dear brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow caused by change. So he's saying, dude, God doesn't change, and God is good and just and pure. Okay. According to his sovereign plan, he brought us into being through his word of truth, so that we would be a kind of first fruits of all he created. That right there, verse 18 is huge. And we're going to get into verse 18 next time about what is this bringing us into being through the truth of his word, so that we would be a first fruits of all he created. What is first fruits? And what in the world does all that mean? There's a lot there. We can't get there today. We don't have the time. That's where we're going to stop reading for today. Okay. And then he kind of changes subjects. If he kind of changes subjects there's a good break right here. So this is where we're going to stop. Let's see if I can get back to my anglicized. All right. You see right here, hearing and doing the word. We're kind of going into another topic here. So we're looking right here. Let no one say he's tempted and being tempted by God, for God can't be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. So then where does temptation come from? Each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. So a desire, when it is conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when fully grown, brings forth death. That's where we're going to be digging in today. So let's get back there. I'm going to share this again. So it's in the context of God not doing this, right? You're in trial. You're in trials and tribulations and things going on in your life. And he says, you're not being tempted by God. Temptation comes from your own desire. And desire, when it's conceived, when it's first sparked, births sin or leads to sin. And then sin keeps going and going and going, and we get a snowball effect. And that brings forth death. All right, that's James' premise here. That's what we're going to dig into a little bit, and I think it's important. So we're going to really, this is where I step back and go, whoa, wait. What is sin? Now, I want you to remember the context that you're in a courtroom. When you're operating in the courts of heaven, Hasatan, or what we call Satan figure, right? It's not, it's a position. Like angels are messengers, Hasatan is an accuser. So you're going to be in court and you're going to be accused, right? There's this accusation going on. So we're in court, right? And the accusations coming against God's children by Hasatan. There's a whole piece there that we haven't fleshed out completely because we're just building as we go. And the reason we're building slowly, layer upon layer, chapter upon chapter, scroll upon scroll, line upon line, is because the identity of God's covenant people has been usurped, stolen, and undermined by pagan systems out in the world. And the return of the sheep, the return of the elect, who are also known as Israel, who are also known as Gentiles, are called to come out of her, my people, come out of the world, yes, and its systems, which includes denominational, empire, religions, and New Age things that break the contract of the new covenant of the reunited house of David. That's the point. You're coming back to the reunited house of David, and you're coming back as Gentile Israel, who went out into the world, mixed with the pagans, and forgot who you are. They are not Israel. Who you think of as Israel is Judah, pretending to be Israel. They removed the boundary stone and took on the name Israel, but that's not who it is. You are Israel. The church isn't Israel, nor are the people who follow Judaism Israel. Neither of those groups are the sheep, nor the elect, nor Israel. It is you. But you have forgotten who you are and your identity has been taken. So God calls Israel Gentiles out of their systems, their janky-ass systems, under false court covenants, and call them home to the reunited house of David, which is what everybody was talking about at the beginning of Acts. Peter talked about it when he was addressing the crowds on Pentecost, and Peter and James talked about it in the book of Acts at the Jerusalem Council. Notice, Israel and Gentiles are the same group of people. It is not the Paul Church. They are not sheep. They are not the elect. I don't care what they say. Neither are the Judaism, Judah, non-Judah, Babylonian people. They're not Israel either, regardless of what a flag says. Israel are the Gentiles coming out of janky contracts in janky systems that were gained by consent or not, or trickery, or generationally inherited ideas and doctrines, and coming home under the covenant, the new covenant, passed down through the patriarchal lineage of David into the Messiah's hands that he taught to you, fulfilling the new covenant in Jeremiah. That's coming home to Zion. So what is the sin that we've been accused of that when fully grown brings forth death? Well, the first thing we have to do in order to define sin is to erase what I call Pollyannity's view of sin, okay? This is all of the ideas that the church has put in our head by following the doctrines of Paul and ignoring the rest of the Old Testament and what Jesus taught and what James taught and what John taught and what everybody else taught except Paul. Because Paul teaches us, they take Paul's words and they make their own doctrine from it, which is a highly dangerous thing. So we're going to erase Pollyannity's view of sin. It can be argued by Paul people that this isn't Paul's view of sin. This is just the modern preacher's twisting what Paul said about sin to make their own doctrine. Either way, it's coming from misunderstanding or the words of Paul, or rightly understanding the words of Paul and teaching that. Either way, it comes from Paul. Okay, so I'm calling it Pollyanity and putting that all into. But here's their view of sin. It has been used, these words of Paul have been used, rightly or wrongly, correctly or incorrectly, twistedly or faithfully, as a guilt and power structure. Catholics, I'm talking to you. Okay? There's two ways Pollyannity's view of sin has been used by the church incorrectly. The first one is the guilt and power structure that you're going to get in the Catholic Church about sin and that whole guilt, sin focus. The other one is in some Protestant denominations do that too. But the other one is like your evangelical and your more liberal Protestant denominations who are like, don't worry about sin at all. Jesus took it all. So it's kind of two sides of the pendulum. And oddly, both sides of that pendulum, the Catholic sin comes from Paul. And then the using that guilt power structure. But also the pendulum swings the other way with Paul. And then you get your evangelicals are like, don't worry about anything. Jesus took it all. Just say Jesus. So there's like two widely variant views of this sin thing. But interestingly enough, both of those come from Paul. So at some point you have to ask yourself, how did these religions all read Paul and all base their teachings on Paul, but yet come up with such different doctrines? Well, welcome to Paul. So the idea of sin has been used as a guilt and power structure. The entire thing of original sin comes from Paul. Now, to Paul's credit, he didn't teach original sin, but they used Paul's words to make the doctrine of original sin. Okay, so there's that. We've covered that a bit. They always say sin is missing the mark. You'll see the Protestant preachers or even some of the more conservatives and Catholics saying, sin means missing the mark. The definition of sin is missing the mark. Well, that comes from a word from the Hebrew, which literally means missing the mark. But nobody asks the mark of what? Like what mark you're missing the target, right? And that's the Hebrew definition of sin. And everyone goes, oh, wow. But nobody stops to ask, what's the mark? Like, what are we trying to hit? Where's the target that we're trying to hit? And then this is where you get this litany of lists of shit you can't do, right? Or you get, well, since nobody can hit the mark, don't even try. So those are your two views, right? You get the Catholics over here going, you're missing the mark. No one can be righteous, not even one. Rah, 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 rah. And then repent, rah, 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 rah. And then you get the ones over here going, well, everybody misses the mark, so don't worry about it. Again, the two views. So what mark are we missing? What mark are we missing? Everyone falls short of the glory of God. You're falling short. Everyone falls short. Everyone falls short. Everyone falls short. That's another Pollyanity cliche that Christians rattle off all the time. Well, Paul says, they should always say Paul says, but they never do. They just make Paul's word, God's word. But you always hear they're missing the mark and they're falling short. Again, I ask of what? What's the standard that we're falling short of? Well, perfection. Doesn't say that. Doesn't say that. The wages of sin is death. And they will guilt you into this over here by saying the wages of sin is death. So if you don't believe Jesus, you're getting death. And that's the whole, we did that also. Or you get over here, the wages of sin is death. You better come to the Catholic Church and do all your things. Both of those come from Paul. The wages of sin is death. Interestingly, James doesn't say the wages of sin is death. James says that when desire gives birth to sin, and when sin is fully grown, it brings death. So like adolescent sin doesn't bring death, just fully grown sin brings death, according to James. So there's a little bit of a problem here between the wages of sin is death and everything else that the Bible teaches, but they don't look at everything else. They look at Paul. There is none righteous, not even one. Oh my goodness, we went over this one as well. But these are some of the phrases that people love to use in Christianity and throw around as cliches and little catchphrases, way out of context. And I'm going to give you an example of that. Here's the Catholic explanation of sin. Are you ready for this? Hold on to your hats. Oh my gosh. List of mortal sins every Catholic should know. So now we have to divide up sin. Okay. The distinction between two types of sin. What sins are mortal? In other words, what lead to death? Mortal sin is a grave matter. Mortal sin is committed with full knowledge of the sinner. Mortal sin is committed with deliberate consent of the sinner. That means mortal sins can't be done. Nobody says this. Nobody says this. Nobody says this. I can't. What kinds of offenses against God constitute grave matter? Well, then they give you a whole bunch of Bible verses, and then they give you this long list. The sins of anger, blasphemy, envy, hatred, malice, murder, neglect of Sunday obligation. They throw that in there. Sins against faith, incredulity against God, of heresy. Sins against hope, obstinate despair in the hope for salvation, or presumption that you can live without God or be saved by your own power. Sins against love, indifference towards charity, ingratitude, hatred of God, constitute a grave matter. These lists of grave sins is based on Jesus Christ's interpretation of the gravity of the Ten Commandments, and grave sins are God's against God. 4 other sins are grave also. These are not only offend God, but man as well. The sins that cry to heaven for vengeance: voluntary murder, impurity against nature, sodomy, homosexual relations, taking advantage of the poor, defrauding workmen of his wages. And they go through and they give Bible verses for all this stuff. Okay. And then there's capital sins, and those are a grave matter. These sins and vices are defined as contrary to Christian virtues of holiness, like pride, avarice, envy, wrath, lust, levity, sloth. And then we get idolatry, blah, 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 blah. Divination, magic, and sorcery, blah, 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 blah. Sacrilege, blah, 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 blah. Atheism, blah, 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 blah. Blasphemy, perjury, and false oaths. Deliberate failure of the Sunday obligation. Notice they can't give a single scripture for that one. It's not in the Bible, but that's... They're making that the Sabbath, but it's not biblical. Honor your mother and father. Must obey their parents and else must obey when they become old. So if you don't take care of your mother when they're old, you're in trouble. Thou shalt not kill, murder, abortion, euthanasia, suicide, scandal. Scandal. Drug abuse, gluttony, alcohol abuse, terrorism, extreme anger, hatred, extortion, adultery, divorce, fornication, pornography, prostitution, rape, homosexual acts, incest, masturbation, theft. And they can't. Oddly, they can't give a Bible verse for that one either. Anyways, theft, feeding, defrauding a worker of his wages, unfair wages, taking advantage of the poor, false witness, adulation, lying. Blah, 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 blah. You see all of this. Ingratitude, lukewarmness, spiritual sloth. I can't. And then we tell you, but you'll be forgiven if you go to church. So my purpose here is to show you the way the church has taken this idea of sin, this moral, spiritual idea of sin, and tried to give you a list, right? Don't worry about loving God. Just here's a list, right? And like, if we go and we do anything on this list, you're in trouble. Go to church. That's how they're using this as the guilt and the power structure, is by trying to make this a list. Okay? It's not a list. Sin is not a list of behaviors or lack of behaviors. I want us to get away from that idea. Sin is not a list of behaviors. Okay? 1 John 5 tells us that there is sin that does not lead to death. So now we've got James telling us that little sin doesn't give death, but fully grown sin brings death. And then we've got John telling us that there is sin that does not lead to death. That's in 1 John 5, I don't know, 16, 17, 18, somewhere around there. But 1 John 5 tells us that. So this whole thing about the wages of sin is death, the wages of sin is death. The only person that said that was Paul. Okay. So we're going to also show you where not to go. There's this website, and anytime you put something in to ask a question, this damned website comes up, and it gives horrible doctrine. So it's called Got Questions, but I say got questions, we got shitty answers. And let's just take, it looks like this. Your questions, biblical answers. This has got to be one of the worst websites. I pull things from here every once in a while to show you how absurd it is. But this place is terrible to build doctrine upon. And the question is, what is the sin that does not lead to death, like I just told you exists in 1 John 5? Well, their answer, and we're not going to read all of this, okay? They give you the context of that quote, and then they go straight to Corinthians and Thessalonians, and they're comparing this back and forth with who? Oh, Paul, of course. And what they get to the bottom, on the other hand, there is a sin that doesn't lead to death, and John does not suggest one should pray on behalf of the one committing that sin. So he distinguishes between these sins, even acknowledges that all sin is unrighteous. Blah, 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 blah. Word salad. They're trying to explain this verse, and they're trying to explain it with Paul, and they can't. So what's funny is at the bottom, what was our question? What is the sin that doesn't lead to death? They don't know. Of course they don't know, because they don't know the Bible. Because I'm going to tell you what the sin is that doesn't lead to death, but here we go. The challenge for interpreters is that nowhere in the context does John detail what sins he's talking about. Notice, does not detail what sins he's talking about. They're looking for a list. Again, they're looking for a checklist of sin because they're viewing sin as a behavior. Sin is not a behavior. It is a frequency, if you will. It is a mindset. We'll get there. He speaks of sins as broad categories, blah, 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 blah. It is probably best, because of the ambiguity, it's not ambiguous. You just don't understand the definition of sin. That's the problem. It's not ambiguous at all. It is probably best to simply acknowledge the principle being taught about prayer rather than try to identify what John doesn't provide in the context. The specific nature of sin that does not lead to death and sin that does. So they're like, just ignore that part and pray because we can't figure it out. That's their answer. Essentially, that's their answer. That's not the answer I'm going to leave you with today. We're going to because they're trying to define sin like the Catholics with a checklist of behaviors, and that's not what sin is. Sin is desire. Remember, James? Sin has something to do. I want to say sin is desire. But sin has something to do with desire. So let's not go to got questions to get shitty answers. We're going to go well past that. What they forgot was that in 1 John 3, just 2 chapters before, just 2 pages, two things before, in 1 John 3, he defines sin for you. And he defines sin as a transgression. Now, then you have to ask you, wait. The transgression of the law. A transgression of the law. So now we have to know, what does it mean for a transgression? Well, transgression is to break a promise, break a contract, break a covenant. Okay? So if I am staying at a hotel and I sign a paper that says you can't smoke in the hotel room, and Callie lights up a cigarette in the hotel room, well, I've now transgressed the contract between me and the hotel, and they can charge me $500 to defumigate the room. That's a transgression. Okay, it's a breaking of a contract or a covenant of the law. Now, where was our covenant? If you watch Revelation, you know what our covenant is at Mount Horeb, Mount Sinai. That would be the 10 Commandments. Okay? But some people see the word the law and they think of all the law. We're going to talk about that too. In the Old Testament, they define sin as rebelliousness against God, rebelliousness against the law, or rebelliousness against Torah. Now, we know from previous videos that word Torah means the first 5 books of the Bible, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are the first 5 books, and they are filled with all kinds of crazy ass laws, like the one I just posted about a few days ago about don't let a man with crushed testicles into the assembly of God. Like that one's in there, right? So that's what people think of the Torah. And Christians think Torah is this book of rules. But is it the first 5 books? Yes, you can call that the Torah. That's man's definition of the Torah. And I would argue that the first 5 books are man's attempt to capture the law of God. And therein lies the problem. The Torah is not really the first 5 books. We call it that because it talks about law. Torah is best defined as God's spiritual law. The law of the kingdom of heaven, if you will. The way shit operates in the grid. The way shit operates in the heavenly kingdom. The way shit operates, according to God, those rules of the kingdom, that's Torah. Okay? It's not written down in the 5 books by man because man can't fucking do that right. All right. So what is the spiritual Torah? Well, here's the problem. And here's just 3 names. Just 3. There's more. Okay? But we've got just 3 names here. Melchizedek, Noah, Abel. I love Melchizedek. We haven't really gotten too much into him. But here's 3 names of people who followed God's Torah, but didn't have the first 5 books of the Bible. Anyone pre-Moses, because Moses is the one, right, that got the 10 commandments and kicked off the whole thing about the law, that all of your Pharisees and priests and scribes and everybody recorded in the Bible, the first 5 books. Okay, they're called the first 5 books of Moses. That came from the mountain. So then you're telling me that anyone that came before Moses didn't follow the Torah. And if you don't follow the Torah and you're a transgressor of the law, then you have sinned and you can't be saved. It doesn't make sense. No, there are people long before the Torah that followed the Torah. There's people long before the first 5 physical books of the Bible that followed God's spiritual law. Okay? And were righteous. And some of those names, there's more, but some of them are Melchizedek. It says Jesus is a priest in the way of Melchizedek. Well, Melchizedek was before the Torah, before the written down 5 books of the Bible existed. And if Jesus is a holy high priest in the way of Melchizedek, who came before the first 5 books of Moses, we've got a problem, guys. Like, what? How did Melchizedek follow the law, the word of God, if there was no first 5 books of the Bible? So the Torah is spiritual. Melchizedek followed it. Noah followed it. And Abel, Moses didn't. Noah followed it. And Abel followed it. Interestingly, all of these men are considered by modern, current Jewish followers as Gentiles. That's just an interesting little factoid. We'll dig that out at another time. That's why they want Gentiles to follow the Noahide laws and not the 10 commandments. They say Gentiles have to follow Noah because Noah wasn't a Jew. Noah was a Gentile. So we're going to give you 10. That's why they call them Noahide laws, because Noah was not a Jew. Noah was a Gentile. So we're going to funnel the Gentiles over here because only those 10 commandments, the covenant was only given to us Jews. So you can't have those. That's not your God. You can't have them. You have to have Noah's God. You have to have Noah's rules, not our rules. It's only our covenant. You can't have it. That's wrong teaching. But yes, Noah was indeed a Gentile. So then Noah's lineage would also be Gentiles. You get where I'm going here, because Jewish isn't necessarily a lineage. That's Israel. We did. So then what? But I'm getting off on a tangent again. You see where my brain goes. So then what is this spiritual Torah that Melchizedek, the high priest that Abraham met, who Jesus takes after, and Noah, and Abel, who was killed in the Garden of Eden by Cain, he was pleasing to God. So you can't be pleasing to God if you're not keeping the Torah. The Torah is spiritual. It is a moral, spiritual understanding of God. That's what Torah is. It is the first 5 books, but it isn't. It's way bigger than that. It's not only the first 5 books, although that's what we refer to it as. There's some problems with that thinking. All right. Failed human behavior. So when James says the desire when it is conceived gives birth to sin. Just look at that part. Failed human behavior is desire that compels us to act in our own favor and begin to define our own morality. This is why lawlessness of polyanity, don't worry about it. Don't worry about sinning, Jesus. That lawlessness of polyanity is so dangerous, because what it ends up doing is it's compelling you to act in your own favor, because just say Jesus. We get to define our own morality, because just say Jesus. We get to make up our whole new doctrine, because we're just listening to Paul. We're not listening to Jesus. We're not listening to the Old Testament. We're not taking biblical truths as a whole and fitting things into context. That's where you're getting this lawless, evangelical, radical, just Jesus, grace alone, hyper grace people. And it's lawlessness is what it is. It's apostasy. That's why the early Ebion in the Dead Sea Scrolls were actually speaking of Paul, and in historical writings too, and said Paul is an apostate. They called him the Antichrist. He's an apostate. He's teaching against Christ because he's teaching against Torah. Torah, spiritual Torah, as well as Torah, book Torah, okay? Because they called him lawless. That's anomia. They call Paul the anomian, which means lawless one. Okay. Torah means to fully love God. Spiritual Torah, the rule of the kingdom, means to fully love God and fully love others. And that leads us back to the 10 something that I always teach about, advocate, study. 10 commandments, guys. 10 commandments are the summation of Torah, if you will. It's the human words that Jesus taught. They're the human expression of God's heavenly vibration. They are the human words, because sometimes, you can't describe the love of God in English terms, in any language. It defies language. Spiritual heavenly things defy human understanding and human language. So the best way to capture those spiritual truths and write it down would be the 10 commandments. Fully love God, fully love others, right? 10 commandments. That's the verbal list, if you will, that still falls short, but can best express in human language concisely the rules of the world of God's kingdom. Okay. And this leads us to Genesis. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. Sin is not a list of behaviors. Sin is the desire, the selfish desire, to act in your own favor. Define your own morality instead of fully loving God and fully loving others. That's what sin is. Period. It is failed human behavior that comes from a desire that compels us to act in our own favor and define our own rules of right and wrong so that we can justify what we're doing by our own rules because we have this desire inside of us. That's the only thing that sin is. And anything that falls under that spiritual category connotates and denotes sin. You got it, you got it. This is why James says, desire when full grown brings forth death, because you are so greedy, so lustful, so convinced that your way is the way, so filled with acting in your own self-interest that you begin to do all this immoral shit and justifying it because of that selfishness, because you're not loving God and you're not loving other people. That is sin. And that's what he means. And notice that it's in the context where God doesn't give that to you. That doesn't come from God. That comes from your own desires to act that way. That's not God. You're turning against God. You are not, your purpose is to live out your life reflecting God's image. You were created in God's image. And when you act in a way that's contrary to that, now you're behaving in sin. That's what it means. That's all it means. That's what sin is. So instead of like, oh my gosh, I said a swear word, right? Oh my gosh, I smoking. Oh my gosh, I got frustrated on the way to work, right? Those are called emotions or human behaviors, and people want to categorize those as sin. Can hostility, frustration, anger, anxiety lead you to death? Yes, because hostility leads to violence, and violence leads to this, and disparaging other people and disrespecting other people, right? So like road rage, right? That can escalate and snowball real quickly. That's what James is saying. So when you have road rage, go, okay, I'm sorry, I got to calm that down. And you turn from it and you re-image God. Turn from it and re-image God. Turn from it and catch yourself. Turn from it and re-image God. That's what this is. That's what sin is. Okay? It's your own selfish desire to get to work on time that pisses you off and makes you hate people. Okay? It's a snowball effect here. It's not a list of behaviors. Sin is anything in which you act in a way for your own favor, rather, and define your own morality to justify yourself. That's sin. That's it. It's not a list, it's shit. All right. And what did Asnakia say forever ago about sin? And this makes so much more sense now that we have James. Sin is an attack on God's children by the enemy. It is, and he's speaking of enemy Hasatan, now the accuser. It is often rooted in the mind and the energy field from yourself, that would be your own desires, or by others who tell you lies about yourself that you believe, right? And it's often carried as a result of a mischaracterization and ill-perceived view of who God is, which is love and mercy and forgiveness and generosity. If you believe the lies that God is this cruel, evil, awful tyrant, you've mischaracterized him. And you have an ill-perceived view of who he is. God is love. God is mercy. God is justice. God is righteousness. God is generosity. God is forgiveness. God is fairness. So if you are not imaging those things, love, generosity, mercy, forgiveness, if that's not who you are, you have turned from being that image because you've forgotten who God is, right? It's not a human failing. It's an attack by the enemy in your mind, putting thoughts and desires and things in your heart and birthing them out so that eventually God doesn't recognize you. You're not acting and imaging him at all, even though you were created on earth to be that. And then he says, dismiss it boldly energetically and thoughtfully, and without guilt or shame. Don't be ashamed of yourself. This is where the whole Catholic shame comes in. No. It's not guilt or shame. It's attack by the enemy. You weren't created to be this. You were created to image God. You've just forgotten who you are, and you're being attacked constantly in your thoughts, in your emotions, in your energy field by the enemy. And that's bringing up these desires and bringing up this covetousness and bringing up this justification. And I'm going to make my own law and I'm going to serve myself. It's that selfishness that we're speaking of. Dismiss it boldly, energetically, and thoughtfully, and re-image God. Don't be ashamed. Just turn around and re-image God. That's repentance. Divinely inspired love does everything if you're willing to accept it. If you're acting towards others, towards yourself, towards God, with this divinely inspired love, and remember who God is, because if you can remember who God is, then you remember who you were created in the image of, and you begin to image that rather than the other stuff. That's what sin is. It's not a list of behaviors. It's transgressing the law of Torah, which is right here. Behaving as an image of God, which is exactly what you were created to do. And if you're not doing those things, then it's sin. Period. Sum it up, to avoid sin, stop breaking legal contracts. Stop signing janky ass contracts out in the world. Join the covenant, follow the rules of the kingdom, and stay in covenant. Good to go. And that's James 1 through 15 or 1 through 18 for now. See you next time. Bye.